this decade, we are going to need to see systems to change. And philanthropy actually has a very important role to play.
Welcome to this podcast produced by the International Monetary Fund. In this program, President and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund, Dr. Andrew Steer, talks with journalist Rhoda Metcalfe about fighting climate change with innovation.
So, for example, the Bezos Earth Fund has invested in what's called the Land and Carbon Watch. Everywhere on the Earth's surface, we will be able to see not only trees falling and carbon going up to the sky, but also a regrowth and restoration. And if we could do that, has huge implications for the development of carbon markets.
There's been a shift in the economic understanding of climate change of late. Climate action, once believed a trade-off to economic growth, is now seen by many economists as an opportunity to drive innovation and increase efficiency. After almost a decade at the World Resources Institute, Andrew Steer now heads the Bezos Earth Fund, which has committed $10 billion towards supporting new technologies that will help reduce carbon emissions. Rhoda Metcalfe sat down with Dr. Steer to talk about his recent article in Finance and Development magazine.
So we're coming out of a summer that there was unprecedented heat, widespread forest fires in a lot of North America, also in Europe. And I think that's really intensified recently the fears about rising climate change. But in your article that you wrote for Finance and Development, you begin with a message of optimism, especially around the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Can you talk to me about why, in some ways, you seem to be hopeful about the future?
Well, first, as you say, the effects of climate change on fires, on floods, on extreme weather. I mean, we're in a pretty desperate situation. And over the last 6 years since the Paris Climate Accord, we've made some remarkable progress. Many people were very critical of the Paris deal because they said, this is ridiculous, this is all voluntary, and no one is going to offer enough. And they were right, of course, the first time round. But now, 6 years later, we have nearly 100 countries now that have said that they will go to net zero by the middle of the century. We have 2,000 companies and a total of 4,500 sort of non-state actors that have committed to going to net zero. That would be totally unthinkable 6 years ago. The notion that a country like China or even a country like the United States would make a commitment to go to net zero would be unthinkable. So too, we would never have dreamt that so many companies would go out on a limb. So that's all good.
But you also suggest that what's beginning to turn the tide in the fight to stop climate change is innovation, and that technological innovation is leading to a shift in economic thinking around climate change. Can you explain that?
Yes, there's been a really remarkable intellectual revolution over the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, 10 years ago, virtually all politicians and virtually all economists would say that it's nice to act on climate change, but it will cost you. It will cost you in lost growth, at least in the short term. It will cost you in higher prices, at least in the short term. But it turns out now that smart action on climate change leads to economic gains even in the short term. And that's been a real breakthrough in understanding. And when we talk about innovation, it's important that we don't just talk about innovation on technologies, but we talk about innovation in ideas. And this is a very remarkable idea, and that is that if you take smart action on climate change, for example, get rid of the $6 trillion in fossil fuel subsidies that Kristalina Georgieva speaks about in one of the articles in this month's Finance and Development, get rid of those. It will not only help the global climate, it will dramatically improve the efficiency of the world economy. And also, climate action will reduce risk. And it will also change expectations about the future. And if you think about these four things together, more efficiency, better technology, lower risk, and shifting expectations, combined, those four things actually lead to more investment, actually more competitiveness, more jobs, and so on. That's not to say that everybody's a winner. I'm talking about the aggregate for the economy. There will be losers, coal miners. And so we've got to think about the losers and the compensation. But overall for the economy, it's a huge gain.
So what do you see as some of the most promising innovations out there in terms of reversing global warming?
Well, in terms of sort of technology, if you like, there are the obvious ones. The price of solar energy has fallen by 99% since Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the White House back in the late 1970s. I mean, this is quite astonishing. And we're starting to see things that would have been just too expensive, like electric cars, as battery prices are falling. In some ways, the exciting things that are going on now are in what used to be called the hard-to-abate sectors. So issues like the steel sector, which needs incredible heat. Think about airlines. Think about intercontinental shipping. These are all economic activities that require huge amounts of energy and cannot easily be electrified using renewable energy. Those are the hard-to-abate sectors. And what we're now seeing is remarkable progress on, for example, hydrogen, so-called green hydrogen. We're seeing progress on long-duration energy storage, for example, and batteries. Now, that's not to say they're competitive yet. There still are pretty significant incremental costs. But each year that passes, we're seeing the prices falling. And in many ways, these technologies illustrate an important fact. You generally will need the private sector to play a leading role, and you'll need the research centers, the academic centers to play a leading role. There's also a role for government here, because companies will tend to underinvest in new technologies, and that's why the government is so important too.
Right. How does private industry fit into this picture? I mean, what is their role?
Well, one of the remarkable things that's happened in the last 6 to 10 years, and really has accelerated in the last 2 years, is the role of business leadership. So if you look at the Fortune 500, for example, there is a significant share of those now that are making commitments and allowing themselves to be held accountable. And this is actually quite a remarkable thing. For example, there's an organization called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is run by 4 major international NGOs. And basically that says, if you're committed to net zero, and if you're committed to a path to get to net zero emissions, and if you're willing to have a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan that is science-based to make sure you're on that trajectory, then you can sign up to the science-based targets. And we will appraise whether or not your targets are ambitious enough. And then you have to report every year on them. So, the question is, who would want to sign up for that? And yet now 2,000 of them nearly have signed up. And the question is, why? And the reason they do is manifold, but one of them is precisely the intellectual revolution that I mentioned earlier, a recognition that actually smart climate action will be good for your bottom line over time. There's also the sort of recognition that we're heading in that direction anyway, so let's get ahead of the curve. There's also a really fascinating development going on right now where young people actually don't want to go and work for companies that are heavy polluters. And there are studies that show if you want to recruit the best staff out of graduate school or wherever, You need to have a science-based target. You need to be a leader. And then, most exciting of all, increasingly, even the financial markets are saying to companies, look, we would really like to know where you're going on climate change. So there's sort of, if you like, a whole bunch of different forces at work. None of them in and of themselves are huge, but adding up, they are shifting the behavior of the corporate sector.
I find it also kind of interesting because, I mean, you're coming from many years at the World Resources Institute that has really led the charge on a lot of these key environmental issues. What's it like to be now stepping yourself into the world of private industry?
Well, it's great fun. Now, I'm not actually in private industry itself. I'm running the Bezos Earth Fund, which is a philanthropy. And so Jeff Bezos very generously committed $10 billion to be spent this decade in grants, primarily, to bring about the system-wide change we need to see to address climate change and to address nature. And so we obviously work very closely with the corporate sector, but I'm not actually representing the corporate sector in any sense. And philanthropy actually has a very important role to play. One can act boldly and one can act quickly and one can be flexible. One can take risks knowing that they won't all pay off. And the way we look at it is that this decade, we are going to need to see systems to change. And everybody knows the sort of the big systems that need to change. We need different energy systems. We need manufacturing to become more circular. We need a new approach to rural development, our food systems, our protection of forests, and so on. So those, if you like, are the big changes. Within each of those, there are some revolutions that need to take place. And some of those are pretty big. You know, they include getting rid of the internal combustion engine. They require increased yields of agriculture and shifting diets towards plant-based food and so on. There's about 50 such sub-revolutions. And one of the things we do is we monitor them all. Where are they on the journey? Some of them are doing fine. Some of them are crossing tipping points. They certainly don't need any help from us. I mean, wind energy in Texas doesn't need any help from anybody. It's doing great. And of those 50, about half of them have real momentum. Then others actually are sort of stuck in the mud, and we may have a role to play there. So yeah, for each of these, we need to decide which of these can our engagement help, and where are the bottlenecks? Where are the barriers that need to be removed? So, for example, the Bezos Earth Fund, has supported some remarkable technologies using satellites to measure methane emissions so that you'll be able to hold accountable all those that are emitting methane from oil and gas plants, for example. So too, the Bezos Earth Fund has invested in what's called the Land and Carbon Watch. Everywhere on the Earth's surface, 3 years from now, down to 10 meters by 10 meters, we will be able to see not only trees falling and carbon going up to the sky, but also a regrowth and restoration. That's carbon coming down from the sky. And so we will be able to see what's called the carbon flux for every single acre in the world, which would be remarkable. And by the way, if we could do that, has huge implications for the development of carbon markets, because you actually will be able to tell, using this highly sophisticated technology, you'll be able to reward carbon sequestration through nature-based solutions, for example. So there is some just very, very exciting new technologies which will hold us all accountable more.
You point out that our current emissions reduction path is still too gradual, it's too modest, and there needs to be more incentives to steepen the curve. Where should these incentives come from, and what role should international institutions like the IMF be playing?
Well, I think the IMF is doing a fantastic job. I mean, the whole image of the IMF has changed, and that's because the behavior and policies of the IMF have changed in the way that they are taking climate change seriously. When I did my PhD in economics and finance, I mean, if someone had said the job of the IMF is to help address climate change, we would have you would have said, that's just totally ridiculous. But actually, as Kristalina Georgieva and other senior managers will say, yes, climate change is relevant because it is macro critical. And our job is to create macro stability in the world and create prosperity in the world. And so it's entirely legitimate that climate risk should be embedded into our, how we allocate our money and the kind of discussions we have with governments. So what needs to happen to change incentives? First, the obvious things. And we need a carbon tax across all countries. So at the moment, only 20% of the world's emissions is under a carbon price. So first you need a carbon price and you need to remove fossil fuel subsidies. But that's not enough, actually. It needs standards and it needs statements of intent that are going to be implemented. So when Prime Minister Modi became Prime Minister of India, he had 2 gigawatts of solar. And everybody thought, well, he'll relax because he's really trying to promote growth in India. He said, no, we're going to have 100 gigawatts. That would be the biggest increase in solar energy in the history of the world. Just in the space of 10 years, he was going to do that. Now, why did he do that? It's because he understood the importance of disruptive change. If you simply say we're going to gradually increase things, the problem is nobody really believes you. They don't change their expectations. But if you say, actually, it's going to be radically different, then you start getting entrepreneurs, businesses, finance to say, it's going to be a different world out there 10 years from now. We had better get ready. And one of the most fascinating things that's happened in the last 3 years is the following. When the IPCC came out with a report 2 years ago, and it said, we were wrong. We thought that if we could simply limit average world temperatures to an increase of 2 degrees, we'd be okay. Our scientists now have concluded that is too dangerous. 2 degrees is simply too hot. It has to be 1.5 degrees. And the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is vast, both in terms of the impact of climate change, but also how difficult it is to achieve it. And everybody assumed that the leaders that had been saying the right things about climate action would run for the hills. In fact, the opposite happened. A whole new generation of CEOs of major corporations stepped up and they said, actually, if we play our cards right, if we are bold and disruptive, we will get ahead of the curve and will be part of the solution. And again, it's precisely the disruptive change leading to longer term profitability and becoming just a more attractive company to your customers, to your workers, to your bondholders, and gives you a sort of authority to operate.
So, Andrew Steer, head of the Bezos Earth Fund, thank you so much for speaking to us today. It's really been fascinating.
Thank you. It's been an honor. Thanks so much.
That was Rhoda Metcalfe speaking with President and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund, Dr. Andrew Steer. Look for Fighting Climate Change with Innovation by Andrew Steer and co-author Kelly Levin, also now at the Bezos Earth Fund. The article is published in the September edition of Finance and Development magazine. Check it out at imf.org/F&D or download the Finance and Development app. And look for other IMF podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter at IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards.
And I'm Rhoda Metcalfe. Thanks for listening.